I never believed in ghosts. To me, they were just figments of overactive imaginations, the stuff of campfire stories meant to spook kids into a sleepless night. But that was before I took the night shift at the hospital, a job that seemed perfect at the time. Quiet, with the promise of solitude, a stark contrast to the chaotic day shifts. It was supposed to be peaceful, a place where time slowed down, where I could escape the noise of the outside world. I had no idea that I was stepping into something far darker, something that would test every belief I held about reality. The hospital where I worked was old, over 100 years at least. It stood on the outskirts of town, isolated by a dense thicket of trees, its towering facade a reminder of its long history. There were stories, of course, whispered among the staff during lunch breaks, tales of unexplained sounds, of shadowy figures seen in the corners of one's vision. But I brushed them off as mere superstitions, the kind of rumors that inevitably build up around a place as ancient as St. Vincent's. The first night on the job was uneventful, almost disappointing in its dullness. The emergency room was quiet, and the only visitors were a few elderly patients in the long-term care wing. I spent most of the night scrolling through my phone, the fluorescent lights overhead humming softly, the only sound breaking the silence. I thought I'd found the perfect gig, easy money for doing next to nothing. It wasn't until my third night that things started to get strange. It was just after 2 a.m. when I first heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against glass. I was in the break room, sipping on a cup of bitter coffee, trying to stay awake. The sound was faint at first, almost imperceptible over the low hum of the vending machines. But as I sat there, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, like it was trying to get my attention. I put down my cup and listened intently. The sound was coming from down the hall, near the entrance to the old wing of the hospital, the part that had been closed off years ago. They said it was due to budget cuts, that the hospital didn't have enough funds to maintain it, but others whispered about the real reason, about the tragedies that had happened there, the patients who had died under mysterious circumstances. Curiosity getting the better of me, I left the break room and walked toward the sound. The hallway was dark, the overhead lights flickering occasionally, casting long shadows on the worn linoleum floor. The further I went, the colder the air became, as if the warmth of the building was being drained away. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. It led me to a set of heavy double doors at the end of the corridor, the entrance to the old wing. The doors were locked, or at least they should have been, but as I reached out to touch them, they swung open on their own, the creaking hinges echoing in the silence. I hesitated for a moment, a strange unease settling in my gut, but I pushed it aside. It was probably just a draft, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The air in the old wing was stale, filled with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, like the faint trace of blood. The walls were lined with empty rooms, their doors ajar, revealing glimpses of abandoned beds and old medical equipment covered in dust. I walked slowly, the tapping now louder, echoing through the empty halls. It was coming from somewhere deeper inside the wing, drawing me further in. As I turned a corner, I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to keep walking, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The figure was tall, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, the kind they wore decades ago. She stood perfectly still, her back to me, her hands at her sides. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. I took a step closer, then another, my nerves on edge. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I was close enough now to see her more clearly. Her uniform was stained, the once white fabric yellowed with age and speckled with dark spots. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her skin was pale, almost translucent in the dim light. Something about her was off, something that I couldn't quite place. And then with a sudden jolt of horror, I realized what it was. She wasn't breathing. For a moment, I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a fear so intense it felt like ice in my veins. Then, slowly, she began to turn, her movements jerky, unnatural like a puppet on strings. As she turned to face me, I saw her eyes. Dark, empty sockets where eyes should have been, like deep wells that seemed to swallow the light around them. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure took a step towards me, then another, her movements becoming faster, more fluid. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of her footsteps close behind me. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see how close she was. I just ran, my only thought to get out, to get away from whatever that thing was. I burst through the double doors, slamming them shut behind me, the noise reverberating through the empty hallway. I leaned against the door, panting, my mind racing. The hospital was silent once more, the air still and undisturbed. Had it all been in my head? A trick of the light? But as I stood there trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it again. The tapping. Only this time, it was coming from the other side of the door. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the doors, half expecting them to burst open at any moment. But they remained shut, the tapping growing fainter until it finally stopped altogether. I didn't sleep that day. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those empty sockets staring back at me, unblinking. The next night, I almost didn't come to work. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the stress of the new job was getting to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Still, I needed the money, and quitting wasn't an option. So I forced myself to go, telling myself that it had just been a one-time thing. But it wasn't. As soon as I stepped into the hospital, the air felt different. Heavier, more oppressive. The lights flickered more than usual, and the halls seemed darker, the shadows deeper. I kept my distance from the old wing, sticking to the newer parts of the hospital where I felt safer. But that night, the peace I was hoping for never came. It started with the lights. They began to flicker erratically, plunging me into darkness for several seconds at a time before buzzing back to life. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me, like someone was watching, waiting. I spun around, but the hallway was empty, just as it had been moments before. Still, the feeling didn't go away. It clung to me, making every hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Then the noises began, soft at first, barely more than whispers. Voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, echoing off the walls. They were indistinct, just on the edge of hearing, but there was something sinister in them, something that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, but it was impossible. The voices grew louder, more insistent, filling the empty halls with their eerie chorus. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see what was happening, to prove to myself that there was nothing there. I walked slowly down the hall, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, the voices now a constant murmur in the background. As I approached the old wing, the double doors began to creak open on their own, just as they had the night before. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. The doors swung open, revealing the dark corridor beyond. The tapping started again, this time closer, louder. My breath hitched in my throat as I saw her again. The same figure from the night before, standing just inside the doorway. Only this time, she wasn't alone. There were others with her now, shadows that moved and shifted, their forms barely discernible in the dim light. They stood behind her, their eyes, empty and dark, locked on me. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped by the terror that held me in its grip. And then as one, they began to move towards me. I stumbled back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me as the shadows advanced. The figures moved with an eerie grace, their feet gliding soundlessly over the cold linoleum floor. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead, cold as the night air that seemed to seep from the old wing. The first figure, the one in the nurse's uniform, was leading the others. Her empty eyes locked on mine. Her face, pale and drawn, was expressionless, but there was something in the way she moved that spoke of an unspoken rage, a fury that chilled me to my core. The others were less distinct, their forms shifting and blurring at the edges, as if they were more shadow than substance. I turned and ran, driven by pure instinct, my only thought to get as far away from them as possible. But as I sprinted down the hall, the lights overhead began to flicker violently, plunging the corridor into darkness, and then harsh, blinding light in rapid succession. The effect was disorienting, making the hallway seem to stretch and contract like some kind of living organism. The walls seemed to close in on me, the floor tilting and swaying under my feet. I reached the nurse's station, my hands fumbling for the phone. I needed to call for help, to get someone, anyone here to witness what I was experiencing, to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. But the line was dead, the phone emitting nothing but a low, crackling static. I slammed it back into the receiver, the sound echoing in the unnatural stillness that had fallen over the hospital. The tapping started again, this time right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching out into the darkness. My pulse raced as I scanned the shadows, expecting to see those hollow-eyed figures emerge at any moment. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was close, so close that I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I whipped around, but again there was nothing, only the silence and the oppressive sense of being watched. The whisper came again, clearer this time, as if it was right in my ear. It was a single word, repeated over and over, like a chant. Help! 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 The voice was soft, pleading, filled with a desperation that sent shivers down my spine. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear, drowning out my own thoughts. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispering stopped, leaving me in a silence so complete it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I dropped my hands, my heart still pounding, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. But before I could gather my thoughts, I felt it, a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the hand tightened its grip. It was ice cold, the fingers long and bony, digging into my flesh with a strength that belied their skeletal appearance. I didn't dare move, didn't even breathe as a second hand, just as cold, just as strong, clasped my other shoulder. Slowly, with a dread that I could feel in my bones, I turned my head. There, standing inches away from me, was the nurse. Her face was inches from mine, her breath icy and stale, like the air in a crypt. Her empty socket stared into mine, and for a moment I thought I saw something dark and malevolent, stirring in those depths. She opened her mouth, and a low guttural moan escaped her lips. It was a sound of unimaginable pain, of suffering that had transcended death itself. The shadows behind her began to move, closing in on us, their forms growing more distinct as they neared. I could see them now, patients, doctors, nurses, each one with the same hollow eyes, the same look of despair etched onto their ghostly faces. The nurse's grip tightened, her fingers digging into my flesh as she leaned closer, her mouth opening wider, as if to scream. But instead of a scream, a torrent of black liquid began to pour from her mouth, thick and viscous, smelling of rot and decay. It splashed onto my shirt, cold and wet, spreading like ink across the fabric. I tried to pull away, but her grip was like iron, holding me in place as the black liquid continued to pour from her, soaking through my clothes, seeping into my skin. It was cold, so cold that it burned, sending sharp, icy pain shooting through my body. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, she spoke. Her voice was low, a rasping whisper that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. "Help us!" The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through my skull like the tolling of a funeral bell. And then I saw it, a flash, a vision so vivid it nearly knocked me off my feet. I was in the old wing, but it was different. The walls were clean, the lights bright, the air filled with the sounds of a bustling hospital. But there was something wrong. The patients, those same hollow-eyed figures, were strapped to their beds, their mouths gagged, their eyes wide with terror. And the staff, the doctors and nurses, were standing over them, holding strange, archaic instruments that glinted ominously in the light. I watched in horror as they began their work, their hands moving with cold precision, performing unspeakable acts of cruelty on the helpless patients. The air was thick with the scent of blood and chemicals, the sounds of muffled screams, and the sickening squelch of flesh being torn open. And then I realized they weren't just doctors and nurses. They were the same figures that were now standing before me, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of existence as they reenacted their final moments. The nurse, the one who had been tormenting me, had been their leader, directing the others with a cold, detached efficiency that sent chills down my spine. The vision faded, and I was back in the hallway, the nurse's grip still tight on my shoulders. Her eyes, those empty, hollow sockets, were filled with an unimaginable sorrow, as if she was reliving the horrors of her past. The black liquid had stopped pouring from her mouth, but it was still there, pooled around our feet, soaking into the floor. "Help us," she whispered again, her voice cracking with the weight of her suffering. It was then that I understood. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trapped, doomed to relive the horrors of their past, their souls bound to this place by the atrocities they had committed. They were seeking redemption, forgiveness for the sins they could never escape. But how could I help them? What could I possibly do to free them from this torment? My mind raced, searching for an answer, but all I could feel was the overwhelming weight of their despair pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, like a spark in the darkness, an idea came to me. The old records, the ones stored in the basement archives. I had seen them on my first day, boxes and boxes of patient files, records dating back to the hospital's opening. If I could find the files of these patients, maybe there would be something, some clue, some detail that could help them find peace. The nurse's grip loosened slightly, as if she could sense my resolve. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I had to do. "I'll help you," I whispered, my voice shaking but firm. "I'll find the records. I'll find a way to end this." Her face softened, the lines of tension and pain easing as she slowly released her grip. The other figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the shadows as the air around me grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floor as I made my way to the basement. The hospital was silent now, the lights steady and bright as I descended the stairs, my heart racing with a mix of fear and determination. The basement was cold and damp, the smell of mildew thick in the air. The records were stored in old metal filing cabinets, their drawers rusted and creaking as I pulled them open. I rifled through the files, my hands shaking as I searched for the names I had seen in my vision. And there they were, file after file, each one detailing the life and death of a patient who had died in the old wing. Their causes of death were listed as natural, but the notes in the margins told a different story. Experimental treatments, unauthorized procedures, medical malpractice on a scale that defied belief. I gathered the files, my mind reeling as I pieced together the truth. The hospital had been a place of horror, a place where the most vulnerable had been subjected to unimaginable cruelty. And those who had inflicted that suffering were now trapped, their souls bound to the very place where they had committed their atrocities. But as I searched, I found something else, a set of documents, hidden at the back of one of the drawers. They were old, the paper yellowed with age, but the words were still legible. It was a confession, signed by the head doctor, detailing the experiments that had been conducted, the lives that had been destroyed in the name of medical progress. I took the documents and the patient files, my hands trembling as I made my way back upstairs. The hospital was eerily silent, the oppressive weight that had filled the air before, now replaced by a strange calm. I could feel their presence, those lost souls following me as I climbed each step, their collective gaze heavy on my back. But the fear that had gripped me earlier was gone, replaced by a sense of urgency. I had to end this. When I reached the main floor, I made my way to the administrative office. The room was dark, the blinds drawn, but I found a light switch and flicked it on. The fluorescent lights buzzed to life, casting a cold, clinical glow over the rows of filing cabinets and desks. I spread the documents out on the largest desk, my eyes scanning the pages as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The confession detailed everything. The hospital's head doctor, along with a select group of staff, had conducted illegal medical experiments on patients, most of whom were poor, mentally ill, or otherwise vulnerable. They had been lured in with the promise of free treatment, only to become guinea pigs for horrific procedures that often resulted in death. Those who survived were left permanently damaged, both physically and mentally. The experiments were justified under the guise of advancing medical science, but it was clear that they were nothing more than a sadistic quest for power and recognition. When the public started to catch wind of the increasing number of deaths in the hospital, the administration covered it up, falsifying records and burying the truth deep in the hospital's archives. But the truth had a way of coming back, of refusing to stay buried. And now, decades later, the spirits of those who had been wronged were restless, trapped in a place that had become a prison for both the victims and the perpetrators.